At Thanksgiving dinner, my own son leaned close and whispered, "You don't live here anymore. Remember?" My plate slipped, cracked on the floor, and everyone stared. I stayed silent, calm, and they thought I was broken. Weeks later during dinner, the server handed Daniel legal papers. The house was still mine. Their faces went pale. "I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." They say when you give something with love, you never ask for it back. For most of my life, I believed that. But I've learned that silence can be mistaken for weakness, and generosity can be rewritten as erasure. This is not simply a tale of revenge. It is the story of what happens when a woman who gave everything learns she was never meant to vanish. The morning my son, Daniel, asked for the house, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't a palace, just a three-story colonial in Vermont with weathered green shutters and a porch that sang each spring when the boards loosened in the thaw. It was the place where he took his first steps, where he cried through his first heartbreak, where I nursed my husband, Michael, until his last breath. Every corner carried memory. When Daniel said, "Mom, we'd love to raise our kids in the house I grew up in," something inside me swelled with a fragile pride. I thought of legacy. I thought of roots. I thought maybe he remembered. I smiled, gave him my blessing, and in that moment it felt like I was handing him more than a set of keys. I was handing him the pulse of a life already lived. What I didn't tell him was that the paperwork remained unfinished, one missing signature away from final. Not because I distrusted him, but because time had taught me love was not always enough to protect you. I tucked the deed away like a quiet safeguard, a precaution I hoped I'd never need. Back then, I was still the mother at the center of things, the one who ironed his shirts for interviews, stayed up with him on late essays, cooked meals when exams loomed. I had no reason to think my name would ever be erased from Christmas cards sent from the very address where I raised him. When Daniel and his wife Vanessa moved in, it felt like a new beginning. I offered to stay in the guest suite on the first floor, still part of the house yet with privacy enough to feel separate. They agreed almost too easily. We painted the nursery together, Vanessa choosing creams and dusty blues. I folded baby clothes when she couldn't sleep. I cooked meals during her pregnancy and brewed tea when the nausea wouldn't let her rest. In those months, I felt useful again, anchored, whole. When little Clara was born, I cried alone in the kitchen, silent tears falling over a pie cooling on the counter, the kind Michael always loved. Her tiny chin mirrored Daniel's, her eyes the same soft calm as her grandfather's. I thought we were becoming a family again, not rebuilding from the beginning, but layering love over old foundations. Years passed, and like any slow erosion, I didn't feel it at first. Then bit by bit, the edges of my place in the home began to crumble. The bookshelf I had built with Michael's hands was replaced with a glossy, modern frame of glass and metal. My teacups vanished into donation boxes before I could ask where they had gone. The garden bench, Michael's favorite spot on summer evenings, disappeared in a redesign. Vanessa smiled through it all. She used words like streamlined and decluttered. Daniel nodded beside her, distracted, unwilling to notice what was being stripped away. I began to wonder if he even remembered how the house once smelled like cinnamon rolls on cold mornings, or if eucalyptus candles had already scrubbed those memories away. Still, I stayed quiet, not out of fear, but because I wanted to believe love given long enough might circle back. I wanted to believe my presence would always matter. I even offered money when they spoke of renovations. They dreamed of opening the kitchen, buying eco-friendly appliances. I pulled from my retirement savings, $42,000 that represented more than numbers. It was my way of saying, I'm still here. I'm still part of this home. They said thank you, but later I overheard them telling friends they had funded the project with smart investments. My contribution vanished, unspoken. I didn't correct them. Instead, I wrote the moment down in my journal, where every small dismissal began to gather like storm clouds. The request changed too. At first, they asked if I could use the upstairs kitchen when guests were over. Then when Vanessa's Pilates friend needed space, they asked me to stay in the attic for the weekend. That attic with rattling windows and thin insulation, where I once stored winter coats and old records. I agreed each time, each yes carving away a little more of me. Daniel started calling it his house. I corrected him once, gently. You mean the family home? He only smiled as if I had made a quaint mistake. Vanessa began hosting gatherings without telling me. One night I walked downstairs in my robe to find strangers sipping cocktails in my living room. She laughed, offered an oops, should have texted, as though I were a guest overstaying. But I kept cooking, kept folding laundry, kept baking pies no one asked for, because motherhood had always been sacred to me. I thought usefulness would anchor me in place. What I didn't realize was that I wasn't being pushed out with force. I was being rewritten into silence, gently erased from the story of my own home. And that, I would come to understand, is the cruelest kind of betrayal. The changes came like whispers, small enough at first to ignore, but constant enough to shape the air around me. One day it was the bookshelf, another day the teacups, the next it was Michael's garden bench. Objects disappeared as if they had never belonged, and with them, pieces of me quietly dissolved. Vanessa had a way of smiling when she dismantled the past. Less clutter, Ellie, she said, her voice light, as though she were offering me a kindness. More calm. She spoke like someone rearranging furniture, not erasing lives. And Daniel, my son, my boy, who once traced constellations on the porch with his father, nodded along. His eyes slid elsewhere when I lingered too long on what had been removed. I told myself it was nothing, that a new family meant new styles, that motherhood required silence and grace. But still, I marked the dates in my journal, each change a quiet tally against the life I had built. When they planned to renovate the kitchen, I offered money. Not because I had it to spare, but because I wanted them to see me, to feel my presence woven into the walls. $42,000. A lifetime of small sacrifices pressed into one check. Daniel thanked me. Vanessa smiled. And then, days later, I overheard them telling friends they had covered it themselves through smart investing. My contribution vanished, rewritten. I said nothing, only wrote the day down in ink that cut deeper than their words. The request began to shift. At first, I was asked to stay upstairs when guests came, just for a little privacy. Then when Vanessa's friend needed space, they suggested the attic for the weekend. That attic with its rattling windows, insulation thin as paper, the room I had once filled with old coats and forgotten records. I agreed, I always agreed. Each yes chipped away at something I hadn't realized was already fragile. It became clear they weren't asking for space. They were asking for my silence. For me to fold myself smaller, until one day I might not exist at all. Daniel began calling it his house, not ours, not mine. I corrected him once, softly. You mean the family home? He smiled like I had made a quaint mistake, the kind you let pass in conversation, though it sliced me open quietly. Vanessa filled the rooms with people I didn't know. Strangers sipping cocktails in the living room, where Daniel had once learned to walk. I wandered down one evening in my robe, surprised by the crowd, only to be met with her laugh. Oops, should have texted. As though I were an inconvenience, a relic that stumbled into the frame. I tried to stay useful. I baked, I folded, I kept the rhythm of motherhood alive, because I still believed there was something holy in being needed. But the air began to change. The language shifted. You'll still need to use the downstairs kitchen, Daniel said once. We've got people coming. Another evening. Do you mind taking the attic room this weekend? Vanessa's Pilates friend is staying. Each word pressed me higher and higher toward the roof, until the home I had built with my own hands shrank around me. At dinner one night, I asked if we were still doing Thanksgiving together, if they wanted me to cook like always. Daniel's voice was casual when he answered. Vanessa's planning something more modern this year. Charcuterie, no turkey. My fork froze midair. So, not family? It's a different kind of family now, he said, shrugging. And Vanessa, with her glowing smile, added, it'll be more of a friendsgiving. You're totally welcome to join, Ellie, if you want. If I want. That night, I sat in the attic, a small space heater buzzing like an unconvincing apology. I told myself maybe this was how aging worked. Maybe motherhood demanded retreat. Maybe my presence was too heavy for their lightness. But the truth arrived sooner than I expected. I overheard Vanessa on the phone. Her voice carried down the hallway, thin but sharp. No, she's still here, I know. Yeah, Daniel's easing her out gently, maybe after the holidays. We've already looked at real estate options. Assisted living or something. Assisted living. The word struck like a blow I hadn't seen coming, though in my bones I must have known. I closed my eyes and let them bruise before they scarred. They weren't hiding it anymore. They weren't pretending I mattered it. And still, I set the table that night. Still, I baked cornbread. Still, I smiled when Vanessa complimented the crust of the pie she never touched. Because if I stopped being useful, I knew what came next. The betrayal wasn't loud. There were no slammed doors, no shouting. What cut deepest were the polite dismissals. The smile that said, "We don't need you." The way they turned my life into clutter. I wasn't just being pushed from rooms, I was being written out of the story I had built. It began with laughter, the kind that cuts sharper than anger, because it tells you you've already been dismissed. One gray Vermont morning, I stood in the downstairs kitchen, fingers wrapped around a warm mug, when I heard Daniel's voice drift from the living room. "It feels so quiet in the mornings now," he said, almost cheerful. Vanessa laughed, soft but certain. "Well, it helps when she stays upstairs." Their laughter spilled together, easy, careless, as if I were a ghost hovering in the hallway instead of the woman who had given them shelter. I stood frozen, the steam from my tea rising against my face, and I didn't breathe until the sound faded. It wasn't only the words that pierced me. It was the tone, like I was some quirky relic tolerated in the background, a faded photograph left too long in the frame. That same week I came home from a walk to find my reading chair missing. It had been velvet once, worn at the arms but still perfect under the bay window. Michael and I bought it the year Daniel started first grade. I asked him where it had gone. He didn't look up from his laptop. Vanessa thought it was time to refresh the space. I waited, aching for him to add something. "We saved it for you," or even, "Sorry, Mom," nothing came. His silence filled the room heavier than words ever could. Something hardened in me that day, the way winter ground turns to ice overnight. A week later, I went searching for my gardening gloves. The shelves had been replaced with sleek white cabinetry, jars lined up like props on a stage set. My gloves were gone. My tools were gone. My roots, gone. I asked Vanessa if she had moved them. She smiled wide, all gloss and teeth. "Oh, that clutter? We donated everything. You hadn't touched it in ages, right?" "Right," that's what I said aloud. Inside, I wanted to tell her the soil had been my prayer, that digging in the earth was how I stayed tethered to the woman I used to be. But I said nothing. I only started writing more things down in my journal, not out of forgetfulness, but to prove, to myself if no one else, that I wasn't imagining the disappearance, that the erasure was real. The small exclusions grew bolder. The guest suite, which had once been mine, was emptied and redone for Vanessa's meditation practice. They pushed me upstairs to the attic, laughing as if it were a temporary solution, as if it didn't sting to have the room I'd renovated with Michael reduced to a yoga backdrop. Still I nodded. Still I smiled. Because when your own child makes a request, there's a voice inside you that whispers, "Don't rock the boat. Don't make him choose." But Thanksgiving made the silence undeniable. I asked if they wanted me to cook like always. Daniel shook his head, eyes on his phone. "Vanessa's planning something modern this year. No turkey, just charcuterie." "Not family?" I asked, my fork stilled halfway to my mouth. "It's a different kind of family now." His shrug was casual, careless. Vanessa added with her sugar-sweet voice, "You're welcome to join us, Ellie, if you want." If I want. The words hung like smoke in my chest. That night in the attic, the heater hummed beside me as I stared at the ceiling. I tried to convince myself this was simply aging, that mothers shrink until they disappear. But the next morning, the truth cut through. From the hall, I heard Vanessa's voice on the phone. "No, she's still here. Yeah, Daniel's trying to ease her out gently. Maybe after the holidays. We've got options already. Assisted living or something." I closed my eyes and let the words strike. They weren't guessing at my future. They were planning it. I was not a person to them anymore. I was a problem to be solved. Still, I set the table that evening. Still, I baked the cornbread. Still, I smiled when Vanessa praised the pie she never even tasted. Because if I stopped being useful, I knew exactly what would come next. But Thanksgiving Day arrived, and usefulness was no shield. Guests filled the dining room, strangers who called me Miss Ellie with polite smiles. The table was pale and sterile, stoneware plates that chipped when you looked at them wrong. No color, no warmth, no memory. I reached for the sweet potatoes, hoping for one small rhythm of the past. Daniel leaned across, gently took the spoon from my hand, and whispered so only I could hear, "You don't live here anymore. Remember?" My throat closed. The plate slipped from my hand, cracked but not shattered on the floor, just like me. Silence fell. Even the baby stopped babbling. Vanessa's smile froze. Daniel just stood there, holding the spoon as if he'd done me a kindness. I bent down, picked up the plate, rinsed it clean, and set it back in the cabinet. Then I climbed the attic stairs, each step heavier than the last. That night, I didn't cry. I sat awake, staring out the window at the yard that used to bloom with roses, now stripped bare, and I made a decision. I would not be buried while I was still breathing. Not in my home. Not ever. Because sometimes the cruelest betrayal isn't loud. It's the quiet erasure of your presence until you almost forget you existed. But I had not forgotten, and I would not let them forget either. If you've ever felt yourself being erased, softly, politely, with a smile, then you know the pain of silence. Keep listening, because what happened next was not an ending. It was the start of my rise. The morning after Thanksgiving carried a chill that seeped deeper than the frost outside. The house was quiet, too quiet, stripped of any trace of warmth the night before had promised. I sat on the edge of the attic bed, staring at the folded sweater Michael once bought me on a crisp New Hampshire afternoon. I used to love that sweater. Now it felt like another artifact collecting dust, proof that I was fading from my own life. I walked downstairs without sound. Years of motherhood had trained me to move through a house like I wasn't there. The kitchen gleamed, every surface scrubbed spotless, as if no feast had ever happened. Vanessa was quick at erasing evidence, erasing sentiment. I brewed coffee not because I craved it, but because the familiar hiss of the percolator was one of the few sounds left that still made the house feel alive. That morning, I opened the file cabinet in the office. It had always been mine, organized by color-coded tabs, sticky notes marking each important memory of paper. Daniel had begun slipping his own things inside, bills, bank statements, anything that didn't match the minimalist design he and Vanessa curated upstairs. But the bottom drawer still held what belonged to me. Third file from the back. Property. Hayes home. I pulled it free, hands steady, and there it was. The deed transfer. Unfinished. The paper yellowed just slightly at the edges. My signature was missing, the one step that kept ownership whole. On the top corner rested a note I had written years earlier, nearly forgotten. Don't sign if you're not treated like family. I stared at the words, the ink faded but sharp enough to cut through the fog of doubt. My chest did not tighten, my breath did not stutter. I felt calm, too calm, and I understood. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something that time would mend. It was a quiet eviction, a deliberate push from the center of my own legacy. That same afternoon, I called Deborah White. We had once been colleagues at the university library. Years later, she reinvented herself, went back to law school in her 50s, and became the sharpest elder rights attorney in the county. She had helped me with estate planning when Michael passed. I had helped her through her divorce. Our friendship had always been quiet, but steady. "Ellie," she said, her voice warm with recognition, "I was wondering when I'd hear from you again." "I need your help," I told her. "Do you remember the deed we drafted in 2016? "You never signed it," she said immediately. "Tell me what's happening." "Daniel thinks he owns the house," I replied, "but legally I never gave it to him. And now it's time I take it back." There was no guap, no judgment. Deborah simply said, "I'll pull the file. Come by tomorrow." When we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, tracing the rim of my coffee mug. I thought about everything I had poured into this family, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, the mortgages paid, the meals cooked, the traditions held together when no one else remembered. And I realized something I had never said aloud. I had never asked for anything in return, not once. But sometimes when you give endlessly, people mistake it for entitlement. They start to believe your presence is interference, your generosity a burden. That night, I pulled out a fresh notebook. Not the yellow legal pad where I'd been tallying the small slights, but something sturdier, a journal for everything. I wrote dates, quotes, incidents. I sketched the floor plan of the house and marked each room where I had been erased. I documented the conversations that cut me open, isolation, dismissal, public humiliation. Each word returned me to myself. At the top of one blank page, in letters firm and bold, I wrote, "He never owned it." For the first time in years, I did not feel small. I did not feel erased. I felt steady, as though I had stepped onto solid ground after wandering too long in fog. The next day, I met Deborah in her small downtown office. She hugged me with no questions, poured a cup of Earl Grey, and slid the file across the desk. "You were smart," she said. "You left enough ambiguity that the house is still yours legally." I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. "I wasn't trying to be smart," I whispered. "I was trying to leave room for grace." "And now," she asked, meeting my eyes, "now I'm out of grace." We smiled, not with joy, but with the clarity of women who had run out of apologies. That week, I scheduled a cognitive evaluation under my maiden name. Quiet, discreet. I passed every test with ease. Memory sharp, reflexes quick, comprehension untouched. The neurologist, kind-eyed and steady, even smiled as she handed me the report. "Your mind is sharper than most people 30 years younger." I slipped the report into my binder like a blade because I knew what Vanessa was trying to build. A narrative of decline. Sticky notes on the fridge. "Take your pills. Don't forget the laundry. Remember to eat." To any outsider, they looked sweet. But I knew they were evidence, proof of a fiction they were writing for me. So I began to play along. I left the kettle boiling a few seconds too long. I walked into rooms and paused as if I had forgotten why. I asked Daniel once where I had left my checkbook, though I knew exactly where it was. Vanessa bit quickly, too quickly. She clung to each moment like a trophy, planting her little notes everywhere. What she didn't know was that I was planting evidence of my own. Daniel had installed security cameras but never finished setting them up. I had my own, hidden where no one looked, inside the porcelain clock that had belonged to Michael. That clock saw everything. The way Vanessa's voice sharpened when no one else was around. The times she read my mail aloud on speakerphone to her friends. The way she treated me not as family, but as a burden to be managed. I cataloged it all. Quiet, patient. And through it, I smiled. I brewed her smoothies. I clapped politely when Clara recited poems that never mentioned me. I folded my presents small so they would believe I had folded completely. Because when they believed I was gone, that was when I would rise. Sometimes the fiercest storms are the ones no one sees coming. They gather in silence, thickening in the air, steadying their weight until the ground trembles beneath unsuspecting feet. That was the storm I was building. I had always known how to move quietly. Motherhood teaches you that, how to patch what's broken without fanfare, how to keep the world turning while no one notices your hands on the wheel. For years, I'd been the invisible glue, holding together a home, a son, a legacy. Now invisibility became my weapon. On the surface, I folded myself into smallness. I smiled when Vanessa clipped sticky notes across the fridge, mirrors, and doors. "Take your pills. Don't forget to eat. Remember the laundry." To her, they were evidence, a paper trail of decline. To me, they were props in a play I allowed her to direct, because I knew how the final act would end. I left the kettle boiling a few seconds too long. I stepped into a room and paused as if confused. I asked Daniel once if he had seen my checkbook, though I knew exactly where it was. Vanessa seized each slip, biting too fast, too eager. Her confidence in my supposed fragility was the leash I handed her, one I intended to pull when the moment came. What she didn't know was that I had already built my garden of proof. Inside Michael's old porcelain clock, a nanny cam blinked unseen. It caught the syrupy venom in her voice when she thought no one was listening. The way she read my mail aloud to friends as if my private life were a parlor game. Every recording, every note of cruelty was saved, cataloged, sharpened into evidence. Meanwhile, I stayed steady. I helped chop apples for her smoothie bowls. I clapped softly when Clara recited a Thanksgiving poem that erased me completely. I allowed them to believe I had collapsed into quiet resignation. It was the perfect disguise. All the while, Deborah and I worked behind the curtain. Page by page, screenshot by screenshot, I handed her my binder. Dates, quotes, receipts, surveillance. We pieced together a case not born of rage, but of precision. Deborah's eyes gleamed with steel each time she turned a page. "You've given me more than enough," she said. "This house is still yours, legally, spiritually, and, soon, undeniably." I nodded, not in triumph, but in calm recognition. For months, I had been painted as fading. For months, they had written me out of my own story. But the truth was written in ink and law, and it carried my name. The power shifted in me quietly. I no longer felt erased. I no longer felt like the attic was my cage. I was not the one trapped. They were, though they didn't yet know it. At dinner, I began to notice the subtle changes. Vanessa's tone sharpened when she couldn't provoke me. Daniel's eyes lingered on me longer than before, almost as if he sensed something he couldn't name. I held their gazes calmly, the way still water reflects without ripple. Inside, I was already moving. I told Deborah I was ready to file. Not a lawsuit for war, but a quiet reclamation, legal retraction of any shared property status, proof of coercion, proof of manipulation. The deed unsigned, the cognitive report pristine, the surveillance undeniable. Every thread woven into a net they could not escape. When I returned home that afternoon, Vanessa stood on the deck, wineglass in hand, laughter pouring into the phone. "She doesn't even realize it's not her house anymore," she giggled. "She still acts like she matters." I didn't interrupt. I didn't turn away. I stood still, the autumn light stretching across the gravel yard she had sterilized of roses. When she finally saw me, her laughter faltered. "Oh, didn't hear you come in," she said lightly. "I've always been here," I replied. My voice was calm, almost kind. "You just forgot to look." Her smile twitched, but I didn't stay to watch yet a collapse. I walked back inside, each step steady, each breath stronger than the one before. Because here is what people forget. When you try to erase a woman quietly, you risk her remembering herself loudly. And when she rises, she doesn't need to shout. She only needs to stand. If you've ever felt pushed aside, made to believe your presence was a burden, know this: you are not gone. You are only waiting. And when your storm arrives, it will not be with thunder. It will be with truth that no one can silence. Stay with me, because the night I chose to unveil that truth, everything they thought they controlled shattered in one quiet final blow. The night I chose for revelation was not random. I wanted the weight of routine, the illusion of control. Dinner was the one ritual they still believed belonged to them. Soft lighting, carefully plated dishes. Wine poured as if they were curating a show for an audience that only existed in their own minds. That night would be my stage. Vanessa spent the afternoon orchestrating details as though the meal were a performance. Roasted chicken arranged on a white platter, sweet potatoes dusted with cinnamon, a kale salad no one really wanted. She flitted around the kitchen with a hostess's pride, every movement rehearsed for approval. Daniel talked about refinancing the house again. My house, he called it. Each word slid across the table like a stone across water, small but enough to break the surface. I sat quietly, sipping water, letting the performance play itself out. I didn't need to interrupt. My moment was already on its way. The doorbell rang just as Daniel was describing interest rates. His voice trailed into silence, irritation flickering across Vanessa's face. "Did someone forget to tell me we had more guests?" she muttered, wiping her hands on a towel. Daniel rose from his chair, still speaking over his shoulder about mortgage options, but his words stopped cold when he opened the door. A man in a dark blazer stood on the porch, a manila envelope in hand. "Mr. Daniel Hayes," he asked. Daniel hesitated, eyes narrowing. "Yes, you've been served." The papers landed in his hands gently, almost respectfully, as if wrapped in invisible consequence. The man gave a curt nod, turned, and vanished into the November air. Daniel closed the door slowly, the envelope heavy in his grasp. Vanessa's fork hovered midair, her mouth parted but silent. Clara babbled softly in her high chair, the only sound in a room that had dropped into stillness. Daniel sat, tore open the envelope, and scanned the first page. His face tightened. The second page drained the color from his cheeks. By the third, I recognized the expression. It was the same look I had seen on students at the university who thought charm could replace study, only to face the truth written in failing grades. "What is this?" His voice was flat, unreadable. I set my fork down with care, dabbed the corner of my mouth with a napkin. My movements were not rushed, not smug, simply deliberate. "That," I said, my voice calm as stone, "is your reminder that I never signed away the deed." He blinked, as if trying to restart the moment. "This says the house isn't mine." "It never was," I replied softly. "Not legally. You had the shell, Daniel, but not the signature." Vanessa found her voice, sharp and trembling. "We've lived here for years. You said—" "I let you stay," I interrupted. My tone was steady, not cruel, not loud, but undeniable. "I never said you owned it." The silence that followed was thick, pressing down on every breath in the room. Daniel's jaw clenched. His hand slammed the folder onto the table, the impact knocking over his wineglass. Red spilled across the placemat, spreading like a wound across the pale surface. "This is insane," he snapped. "You're kicking us out?" "I'm reclaiming what was always mine." Vanessa's voice rose, desperate now. "After everything we've done for you?" A small laugh escaped me, not out loud, but inside, in the place where dignity had been sharpening for months. "You mean letting me sleep in the attic? Taping notes to the fridge so people would think I was losing my mind? Reading my mail? Throwing out my things?" Her lips parted and closed again, words caught in her throat. She looked at me as if I were a stranger. Perhaps I was. Perhaps the woman they thought they had erased no longer existed. I rose slowly, not with drama, but with certainty. The room seemed to expand around me. "I didn't want this," I told them. "But you made it clear there was no space for me in the home I built. So now there is no space for you in the home you borrowed." Daniel whispered something under his breath. I didn't ask him to repeat it. Whatever it was no longer mattered. I gathered my plate, carried it into the kitchen, and scraped the untouched food into the compost bin. The sound was sharp, final, like the shedding of skin. I rinsed the plate, dried it, placed it back where it belonged. When I returned, the air was still heavy, but it no longer pressed against me. It pressed against them. That night, Deborah texted me. "It's done. They've been legally notified." 15 days. After that, the locks change. I stood on the back porch, the November air biting at my cheeks, and watched the last of the daylight sink behind the hills. My hands were steady. My heart was quiet. Not triumphant, not angry, simply free. For the first time in years, I no longer needed permission to exist. Some storms don't roar with thunder. They arrive in silence, steady and unstoppable, until the ground you thought was yours is gone beneath your feet. That's how the house began to shift. Not its walls or its beams, but its soul once the truth was laid bare. Daniel moved through the rooms like a man carrying invisible chains. His footsteps were heavier, his voice lower, his eyes searching for a way to rewrite what could not be undone. He tried the reason the first. "Mom, this doesn't have to be ugly," he said one evening, standing in the doorway of the attic as though he still had authority there. "It isn't ugly," I replied calmly. "It's simply mine again." He swallowed hard, his shoulders tightening, but he didn't argue. He turned away, descending the stairs slowly, each creak echoing like confession. Vanessa was less composed. She stormed through the kitchen in clipped heels, slamming cabinet doors, her voice raised in brittle outrage. "Do you know what people will say when they find out? Do you have any idea how this looks?" "Yes," I said, folding towels in a basket, my tone as steady as the rhythm of my hands. "It looks like truth." Her fury filled the room, but it never touched me. I had lived through the quiet erosion of love, the slow bleed of belonging. Compared to that, her anger was only noise. The neighbors began to notice changes. A moving van appeared one Saturday, carrying out the sleek furniture Vanessa had insisted on, the sterile pieces that had erased warmth from the house. She paced the yard on her phone, her voice sharp, rehearsing explanations for why she was downsizing and seeking new opportunities. But the town had memory. They knew this house. They knew me. Whispers traveled faster than she could spin them. Clara asked questions no one could answer cleanly. Why are my toys in boxes? Why isn't Daddy fixing the swing? Her voice was small, but it pierced deeper than all of Vanessa's shouting. I knelt down, brushed Clara's hair from her face, and told her, "This house will always hold you, no matter where you sleep." It wasn't a lie. The walls had seen her laughter, her first steps, her songs. She would never be erased here. Inside me, something powerful and unexpected began to bloom. Not triumph, not revenge, something steadier. Presence. For years, I had allowed myself to shrink, to fold into corners, to survive on usefulness instead of identity. But now, each breath filled me fully again. Each step through the house felt like reclamation. Deborah visited often during those weeks, papers in hand, reassurance steady in her voice. "They've got 2 weeks," she said one afternoon, "and no legal ground to stand on." "I don't want them destroyed," I told her. "I only want them gone." She nodded. "Sometimes leaving is punishment enough." At night, I sat by the bay window where my velvet chair once stood. I imagined Michael sitting beside me, his hand warm on mine, his voice soft but sure. "You held on, Ellie. You remembered yourself." The last Sunday before the locks changed, Daniel tried once more. He came into the kitchen while Vanessa was upstairs, his face drawn, his voice rough with something like regret. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he asked. Why didn't you say you hadn't signed it?" "I wanted to believe I didn't need to," I answered. "I wanted to believe love was stronger than paper." He looked at me for a long time, his jaw tight, his eyes wet but refusing to fall. Then he left without another word. Vanessa did not speak to me again. She moved through the house like smoke, visible, choking but temporary. On the 15th day, she slammed the door behind her one final time. The echo faded, leaving behind a silence that was not empty, but clean. I walked each room slowly, touching the walls, opening the windows, breathing in the air as if I were meeting the house anew. It felt lighter, as though it had been waiting for me to reclaim it. The roses in the garden would bloom again. The attic would be storage, not exile. The kitchen would smell of cinnamon rolls, not sterile candles. I was not a guest anymore. I was home. And here is what I need you to understand. This was never about revenge. It was about survival, about refusing to vanish from the story I had written with my own hands. If you've ever felt erased, if you've ever watched your worth reduced to silence, let my story remind you, you can take it back. Your presence is not negotiable. Your voice is not clutter. Stay with me, because the ending of this story is not sorrow. It is fire. It is freedom. It is the kind of ending that makes you believe in beginning again. The house exhaled once they were gone. Walls that had carried whispers of dismissal seemed to breathe again, filling with the warmth of memory rather than the chill of erasure. For the first time in years, I walked through each room without bracing myself for what had been taken. What remained was not emptiness. It was space, raw and waiting, like soil ready for planting. I began with the small things. The attic was the first room I reclaimed. I pulled the boxes from the corners, swept away the dust, and opened the window wide. The November air was sharp, but it carried promise instead of punishment. I folded my sweaters neatly into the cedar chest, not as an exile, but as a choice. This room was storage now, not a cage. Next came the guest suite on the first floor. I stripped away the sterile cushions Vanessa had chosen and replaced them with quilts Michael's mother had sewn decades ago, patterns of burgundy and cream that told stories with every stitch. I placed a photograph on the dresser. Michael and me standing in front of the house the year we moved in, Daniel still a boy perched on his father's shoulders. The room felt whole again, anchored by memory rather than aesthetics. The kitchen took longer. It had been gutted of warmth, scrubbed too clean, the walls painted in tones that spoke of magazines, not family. I hung copper pans where Vanessa had insisted on glass shelves, their soft glow catching morning light. I brought back the smell of cinnamon rolls, letting sugar and butter saturate the air, the way it used to when Daniel was a boy, when Michael would sneak bites of dough before I caught him. The oven door clicked shut, and for the first time in years, the sound felt like music. In the garden, I knelt in the cold dirt, fingers stiff but steady as I dug. The earth remembered me. I planted roses again, the same variety Michael had loved, deep crimson blooms that would rise when spring returned. My knees ached, but the ache felt honest, alive. Clara's small laughter echoed faintly in my mind as I pressed soil over the roots and I whispered into the wind, "This will be here for you, always." Neighbors began to stop by, curiosity giving way to familiarity. Mrs. Andrews from across the street brought over a basket of apples. "It feels right seeing you here again," she said, her eyes kind. Mr. Lopez offered to help mend the porch steps, his hammer in hand before I could protest. The community had not forgotten me. They had only been waiting for me to return to myself. Evenings became mine once more. I lit the fireplace, the crackle of wood replacing the sterile hum of candles. I read books aloud to the silence, not because anyone needed the sound, but because the walls deserved to hear voices again. Sometimes I spoke to Michael, letting my words drift upward like smoke, telling him about the roses, about the neighbors, about how the house was finding its soul again. Daniel wrote once, a short letter folded neatly tucked into the mailbox without return address. It said only, "I'm sorry, I didn't see what I was doing until it was too late." I read it 3 times before tucking it into my journal. I did not write back. Forgiveness is not denial, but it is not obligation either. Some wounds close quietly, without words, and that was enough for now. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The winter passed, snow folding the world in white. I shoveled the walkway myself, each scoop of snow a reminder that I was capable, that I was still here. In January, Deborah visited, carrying tea and laughter. We sat by the fire, 2 women who had lived through storms, letting the quiet of survival settle around us. By spring, the roses began to rise, small shoots breaking through the soil, fragile but determined. I spent mornings in the garden, afternoons by the bay window, evenings with the fireplace. Life was not grand, but it was mine. The house was not simply a building anymore. It was a testament to memory, to resilience, to the refusal to disappear. I had not sought revenge. I had sought reclamation. And what I found was deeper than ownership. I had found myself again. Spring came gently, carrying with it the kind of light that softens even the hardest edges of winter. The roses pushed through the soil, stubborn and certain, each bud a reminder that even after being cut back, life returns fuller. I tended them daily, not as escape but as communion, with Michael, with memory, with the parts of myself I had almost allowed to vanish. The house felt different now, not quieter, not emptier, truer. The echo of footsteps no longer carried dread. The rooms no longer whispered of dismissal. They breathed. They held me. They belonged to me as much as I belonged to them. I made changes slowly, not to erase but to restore. The attic became a library, shelves lined with books I had saved through every storm. The guest suite became a place of welcome again, quilts folded neatly, always ready for a friend who needed rest. In the kitchen I baked more than I could eat, loaves of bread, cookies that perfumed the air so richly that neighbors sometimes paused on the sidewalk just to breathe it in. I gave away what I couldn't finish. In return, they brought me stories, laughter, company. The house was alive again. One evening as dusk settled over the yard, I sat by the bay window with a cup of tea. I looked out at the roses, their stems lifting toward the fading light, and I felt a steadiness I hadn't known in years. Michael's photograph rested on the windowsill. His eyes, caught in laughter decades ago, seemed to meet mine. I held on, I whispered. We held on. Daniel visited once in early summer. He stood on the porch, shoulders slumped, a bouquet of supermarket flowers clutched in his hand. His knock was hesitant, almost childlike. When I opened the door, he didn't step inside. "Mom," he said softly, his voice roughened by something heavier than pride. "I'm sorry for everything." I studied him, the lines etched into his face, the weight he carried, the boy still hidden beneath the man. I took the flowers, placed them gently on the table behind me, and nodded. I know. He wanted to say more, I could see it, but some apologies live best in silence, in the act of showing up with lowered eyes and empty hands. I didn't invite him in, not yet. Healing has its own rhythm, and mine was not ready to stretch that far. Still, I closed the door without bitterness. That too was a kind of grace. In the evenings, when the house grew quiet, I often read aloud, not for anyone else, but for myself, for the walls that had listened to so much silence. My voice filled the rooms again, strong, steady, undeniable. Each word was proof. I was here. I had always been here. The house was never simply a structure. It was legacy. It was memory stitched into wood and stone. It was the place where laughter had lived, where grief had carved its mark, where betrayal had tried to erase me and failed. I was not erased. I endured. And now I understood what Michael had always told me, that survival is not just about holding on. It is about reclaiming the space you were told no longer belonged to you. It is about standing firm in your story, even when others try to rewrite it. The roses bloomed that summer more fully than they ever had before, deep crimson blossoms swaying in the breeze. I walked among them, touched their petals, and smiled. They were proof that life can return stronger after being cut back, that roots cannot be stolen, that presence cannot be erased. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of living again, not as a shadow, not as a burden, but as myself. If you've ever been made to feel invisible, if you've ever been pushed aside and told you no longer mattered, let this be your reminder. You are not gone. You are still here. And your voice, your presence, your life are not clutter. They are truth. So hold on. Reclaim your space. Stand in your story without apology. Because when you rise, the world cannot help but see you.